Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Earth in Crisis. My name is Aurelio Muraca. I'm the Technology Program Coordinator here at the Danbury Library. On behalf of the Friends of the Danbury Library, we welcome you to another episode of Earth in Crisis. And tonight's episode is How Earth's History Shaped Modern Climate. And tonight's talk, as usual, is Professor Mitch Wagener of the Biology Department at Western Connecticut State University. And Mitch, you have the con, sir.
Okay, and here I am with my sidekick Ringo.
Ringo.
Yep. He every time he hears a voice on the screen, then he has to come up and make his appearance. So he'll go jump down in a minute. Okay, so I teach biology at Western, and you guys have all heard me talk about that, I think. But I always start with this particular slide. All right, let's see. So we'll be talking about natural history, and natural history is one of those things that people will learn about their backyards or the birds or the flowers that they like because it's interesting to them, and it's how those organisms live their lives and live their lives and how they and what part they play in the environment. Well, what we're going to be talking about today is how climate affects the natural history of the organisms that we're familiar with and how they will also affect climate, and particularly as the world gets warmer. Well, we happen to live in a spectacularly beautiful place, the only planet like this that we have firsthand knowledge of. And it is something to be treasured. And I think maybe we take it for granted more than we should. In our warming world, there's a number of things that are going on. And if you've seen my talks before, you'll remember this slide. And this is just kind of a summary. And it's showing us as the world warms because of accumulation of certain gases in the atmosphere. There's a number of things that are going up that can be measured. You can measure them in your own backyard, at least some of it. And there's tons and tons and tons of data, and so that there's really no rational objection to the reality of climate change. Scientists will sometimes argue back and forth about some of the mechanisms or the speed at which certain things are happening, but scientists that are not bought and paid for are in fact quite in unanimity about the fact that it's happening. All right. So all these things, the glaciers melting, the snow cover melting, and the tree line shifting northward, and the sea level going up, and all this stuff affects organisms. And to some degree, the organisms have feedbacks back into those particular things that are going on. All right. And we have, not only do we have, a little diagram with an arrow telling us what is happening, but we also have tons of data. And Ripple et al. In 2020 published 2 papers which take some of the more important things that we observe and quantifies it for us, so we can see how fast the Greenland ice mass is changing and how fast the sea level is changing and all that stuff from data. And so we don't necessarily have to take anything on faith. You shouldn't. In this case, you should, find scientists you can trust and listen to them. And feel free to ask questions about things. You know who you can trust if the authority you ask, and if you ask them a question that you don't know and they admit that they don't know, that's a pretty good sign that the person you're talking to is honest. All right, so I'm an ecologist. That is my particular specialty within the sciences, and my main focus, and for the last 20 years has been, or 15 years has been climate change education. Well, I'm an ecologist, which means that I study the different connections of organisms with various parts of their environment at different levels, potentially different levels. I'm from Missouri originally, went and did fish and wildlife as an undergrad major, got my degree there, then went to Alaska as for my graduate degrees. So I have a master's degree in soil in stream ecology and a PhD in soil ecology. And so we're going to be talking a little bit about things such as permafrost and things like that, which you don't hear too much about around down here unless you're reading about climate change. There are all sorts of representations of complicated systems that are drawn in a simple way so that we can understand and wrap our brain around them. That is what we call a model. A model is a simplification of reality that has built-in assumptions, which is where the simplifications are. And humans have to use models because our brains are not infinitely strong. Our brains are not infinitely fast in our thought process. They don't have infinite amounts of storage space and all that. And because of that, we have to simplify things so that we can study various parts of it. And one of the models which is particularly useful in ecosystem ecology, the ecology of big systems in the environment, is this one. And it basically talks about how the kind of ecosystem that you're going to find any place on Earth is going to be determined by um, five large-scale factors: the time since it was last disturbed, the type of rock that goes into the making of the soil, how hilly it is, what the topography is, what is local plant life like, and what the climate is like. And these things interact on large scales and small scales to determine, what grows in your backyard and what kind of soil you've got and what kind of trees that are going to occur. They're going to grow up if you don't mow your lawn and all that kind of stuff. Okay, very useful thing for those of us. And so we'll be talking about some of this stuff. It is true, and it is demonstrated that as the world warms, it's going to change what type of plants grow within a particular area. In a warmer climate, you got different kinds of plants that then grow in a cooler climate because the different plants and animals too, for that matter, have different tolerances. But it's also true that the vegetation changes can affect the climate. Okay, it's not just the climate affecting the vegetation, but the converse is also true. So that if you take a forest and cut down on the trees and turn it into a farm, then you're changing the amount of evaporation that is releasing water to the atmosphere in that area. You're going to change the surface temperature, and you're going to change, if you're dealing with a large enough space, water, the rainfall. Okay. And this has been demonstrated everywhere that it's been tested at large scales. Well, one of the things you see in textbooks, and sometimes professors will show them to students in their ecology classes, are these big diagrams showing how some particular element cycles through the environment, water in this case. Okay. And the water evaporates and then forms clouds and then causes rain, and on and on. Okay. These are very useful, but they're also simple. They're a simplified version of reality because they're just showing you kind of the general kind of things going on. But they're still important for students to learn and for all of us to understand what the heck's going on. Another important model, which helps us to understand something about why the woods in Connecticut and up on the hill in Bethel, where I live, live pretty close to Aurelio, and is different than, say, a similar suburban site in Florida or Alaska, for that matter, or pick your spot. The the vegetation will be different. The amount of nutrients in the soil will be different. The everything will be different. And Mayor. And one of the models that is useful to us basically explains how the precipitation, the yearly precipitation in an area, and the average temperature in that area will determine what kind of environment you have. Okay, the difference between, no joke, no surprise, the difference between a forest in Florida and the forest in Connecticut is the fact that it's cooler up here, and our soils are different and things like that. And so you can look at this graph and have someone give you a pair of coordinates. How much precipitation, X amount of precipitation, Y amount of air temperature, and you can predict what kind of vegetation is going to be there. Okay. Now, this is important in a warming world because if you are in a particular spot and the environment is warming as it is, you're going to have, and if you're near a boundary between one of these biomes and the other, then you're going to have noticeable changes, maybe over a long period of time. For instance, in the far north, there is a kind of a broad line between the areas where trees will grow and where they will not grow. It's called the tree line. Okay. So poleward of that tree line is tundra, and the other direction is northern boreal forest in North America. There isn't much in South America at the right latitude to actually grow forests, just a little bit, but not much. And so what we're seeing as the world warms up is that the trees are growing farther north than they once were, so that the tree line is, the tree line is moving north. The forests are moving north. One of the reasons why trees don't grow in the far north is that much of the soil is frozen year round. There are places around Fairbanks, Alaska, where I lived for 13 years, where if you put a shovel in the summer, if you put a shovel in the ground, your shovel will go down a couple inches and you'll hit what feels like cement. Be like trying to put your shovel through the sidewalk. And if you dig down and you stick your hand down in the hole and feel it, you'll realize that it's cold down there. It's frozen soil. It's called permafrost. And so you can have permafrost form anywhere where the global or the average annual temperature is below freezing. And so it is one of the things that determines where trees grow and where they don't. In around Fairbanks, where I lived, on the south side of hills, there was not permafrost, and so you'd get white spruce trees. On the north side of hills, you had spotty patches of permafrost because the north side of hill doesn't get as much heat as the south side of hills. And because of that, you can't grow white spruce, but black spruce will grow and things like that. Permafrost is a big deal because permafrost not only determines what kind of trees grow in a particular area. But that soil that is frozen used to be not frozen back in warmer times. And so there's a lot of CO2 and methane that are trapped in that permafrost, so that when they melt, as they will gradually and then suddenly, as Hemingway said, um, you'll release CO2 and methane into the atmosphere, further warming the earth. So one of the systems that we see that is controlled by heat, which then controls the melting of the ice, which then controls what kind of bacteria are active in the soil, and then feeds back to heat, is this system. The warmer it gets, the more the permafrost melts. The more the permafrost melts, the more of the carbon dioxide and CO2, carbon dioxide and methane that were produced by bacteria will be released to the atmosphere, and the warmer it gets. The positive feedback system. Permanently frozen soil is about 24% of exposed land in the Northern Hemisphere. So there's a lot of it, and partly because there's a lot of land in the Northern Hemisphere. There's far less in the Southern Hemisphere at the right latitude to have permafrost. In the north, the biome, the kind of plant community you find there is taiga, the northern boreal forest, and tundra. Right. In Alaska, it's mapped, and of course these maps have to be redone every so often to this one's 82. No, this is 2002. So, that's 20 years ago, and I'm sure the lines of where the different kinds of permafrost are found have changed. One other thing you find if you drive up the Alaska Haul Road up towards Prudhoe Bay, where the oil wells and stuff are these in a very flat land, you'll find these round hills that sometimes predators like white snowy owls and gyrfalcons will perch up there looking around for mice and voles and stuff which they can catch for dinner. These things are called pingos. And often, the closer you get to the Arctic coast, the more pingo, the only kind of hills you're likely to find are pingos, at least in northern Alaska. They're soil-covered mounds of ice. They can reach 70 meters high, 600 meters in diameter. They have an ice lens, frozen, that is pushed up by frost heaving, the same thing that pushed the stones in Connecticut up to the surface that farmers had to move and make stone walls out of, same process. And the pingos, well, let me show you a picture. This is what pingos look like. They look like the top of a brioche, a French bun. And the ice is partially melting more up there than it is down at the bottom, and so on. And this is what passes for topography in the Arctic. These ice wedges the ice lenses can be quite thick, and sometimes they will melt at the surface and leave a little pond at the top. One time when I was driving up the Hall Road, taking some Russian scientists up to Prudhoe Bay to put them on a flight back to Fairbanks, I saw a snowy owl sitting on a pingo. Only snowy owl I've ever seen. That's the snowy owl for those of you who are not bird watchers, is Hedwig in Harry Potter, that white owl. I also saw gyrfalcon, which is the largest falcon species and are found only in the high Arctic in Alaska. And I'd never seen one of them before. So it was a big treat. And both of them hanging around a pingo where they could get up high and look down. Also, another thing you find up there are these things called ice wedges, and they're basically frozen ice that will form cracks and will melt around the edges in forming these polygons. And they look like, old walls from an ancient civilization, but what they are ice where you had a crack that meltwater made larger over the years until you've got this particular, you get these shapes. Now, if you look at it from the air, you'll see that a bunch of these ice wedges will have melted, forming little ponds, which which if you go in and take a net and drag through the little ponds there in those polygons, you'll find large invertebrates. These large invertebrates happen to be excellent food for baby ducks and geese. And so the ducks and geese fly up to the Arctic to reproduce because there is food available for them and they don't have to compete with fish for that food. The reason why those big invertebrates are found in those meltwater ponds on the polygons is because there's no fish that can live there because they freeze solid in the winter. Fish can't bear that, but the invertebrates can. Big crustaceans and stuff. And so every spring you'll see gazillions of ducks and geese and cranes and phalaropes and all sorts of other things flying north up to the North Slope where they are going to mate and raise their babies, and then they'll all fly south again because there's food for them up there. All because the Arctic tundra tends to melt in this particular fashion and provide lots of habitat for baby duck food. Permafrost is a northern phenomenon. Now, like I say, there's not much of the southern hemisphere that's at the right latitude. There's some in edges of Antarctica. There's probably a little bit down in Tierra del Fuego and southern part of South America. Um, but it is found circumpolar in the Arctic. Now, one of the things about permafrost is that patches of water support particular kind of bacteria. Particular kind of bacteria are ones that produce methane as a waste product. The reason why we have abundant natural gas to cook our meals and heat our homes and all that stuff is that there, back in the Carboniferous, hundreds of millions of years ago, there was a lot of methane produced in swamps in around the world, and that stuff then got buried. And it also is produced by bacteria during the process of fossilization of swamp plants to make coal and and fossilization of ocean plankton to make petroleum. But these bacteria that produce this stuff live in all sorts of places, like sewage sludge, and sewage treatment plants, and the hind-gutted termites, and wet wood in trees, and the rumen of a cow, and the cecum of a horse. The human large intestine some people have some of these bacteria that produce methane, and hydrothermal vents down in the bottom of the ocean and all sorts of places, rice paddies. Places that are wet and where oxygen is in short supply are favorable to the bacteria that can make methane. Now, I'm a soil ecologist by training. I studied all the creepy crawlies, such as they are in Alaska, help break down leaves, and bacteria and fungi that break up the leaves as part of decomposition, which is part of the natural process of things. Um, and to an ecologist, soil is a living, breathing material where you have organisms eating dead stuff and organisms eating other organisms, and it's just like a jungle. I mean, it might as well be the Serengeti Plain in miniature. And there's just a lot of the same sorts of things going on, predators and prey and everything. Um, but it's happening underneath our feet. So to an ecologist, soil is a three-dimensional matrix of water and dead plants and forms an ecosystem. And it's full of fungi. A leaf falls to the ground. It will be rained on, which will cause certain chemicals to leach out of the leaf and trickle into the soil. The soil will be gobbled up by a millipede or a earthworm or other things. It'll get broken up into little pieces, which then smaller things can eat, and so on. And the organisms that actually take the leaf and turn it into CO2 are fungi and bacteria, because they're the ones that have the right enzymes. Here's a scanning electron microscope picture of a leaf in the process of decomposition, and you can see the fungi, the fungal hyphae, the tubes, and all those little oblong things are bacteria. And you can see the fungi are a lot bigger than the bacteria. To a farmer, a soil is the stuff where you grow your crops, and they're the two visions are not that are not in contradiction, but they're just different perspectives based on what's interesting to the ecologist as opposed to what's interesting to the plant. I mean, to the farmer. To the farmer, the amount of water in the soil, the amount of nutrients in the soil is what they're interested in. How it comes to be there is of less interest to them than it is to an ecologist. While I was doing my thesis defense in 95, I guess, I was in a department, my department where went to grad school, was full of wildlife biologists. And so since I was doing soil decomposition, I wanted to put the scale of the organisms in a scale that they could understand. And so moose are a big thing up there, and they're big because they're big and they're an important part of the local ecology and everything. And so if you define a moose as one unit of ecological scale, the Pseudomonas bacteria that decompose leaves are operating at the scale of 1/500th of a femtomoose, 5 times 10 to the minus 17 mooses. So it was meant as a joke, and I got lots of laughs and all that. It's a science nerd joke. All right, well, I did that one. So another thing that's important, where the environment and the climate can have an effect on organisms and organisms have an effect on those things, is in a process called succession. Let's say you got tired of mowing your backyard. We've all been there, right? You get tired of putting gas in the lawnmower and dealing with all that. Or you get so old that you don't want to push it yourself, and you hire your grandson to do it or whatever. And there'll become a time where I'll do that. Let's say instead you just said, okay, hell with it. We're just going to let nature take its course. Okay. And what would happen in that area is the grass would grow up, and you'd get plants with wind-blown seeds would be blown in, and you would get dandelions, of course, but you get broom sedge and you get ragweed and you get all sorts of stuff. And then you'll start seeing little trees growing, being seeded in there. A squirrel will bury a butternut, and you'll get a butternut tree growing and all this stuff. And gradually over time, this will revert to forest, which is what happened when the farmers back in the early part of the 20th century decided they were tired of farming, and they couldn't, the fields were too big because of the stone walls. They couldn't use farm machinery in it to do it properly. So they said to hell with it, and they went into town and worked whatever jobs they worked. And gradually that forest or that farmland reverted to forest, and through a process called succession. That's the process where one set of organisms will come in, change the environment, uh, making it good and attractive for another set of organisms, and gradually you reach a stable environment, which is called the climax forest. Okay. Now, if you start with your yard, which already has soil intact, it can happen pretty quick, decades. If, on the other hand, you are looking at succession as it occurred after the last ice sheet melted 16,000 years ago, then you're not starting with soil, you're starting with rocks. And it takes a longer time to turn rocks into forest than it does to turn already present soil in your backyard into forest. So one of them, the one where you're starting from with nothing, with rocks, is called primary succession. The other one's secondary succession. And what happens is the rocks will be colonized by lichens, and which is one of the first organisms which will be found, and then moss, and then you'll get enough a little crack of with some organic matter in there forming a little tiny bit of soil, and then you get some grass, and it takes a long time to turn rocks into soil, and it takes hundreds of years. Okay, because you start with bare rock and then you go to lichens and mosses and herbs and weeds and grasses and shrubs and pines, hickories, and immature oaks. And then the climax community around here is oaks and hickories and maples and tulip poplars and beech trees, and used to be American chestnuts. Okay. Pine is a mid-succession plant because it can't reseed itself. It doesn't grow. The baby pine trees don't grow well in the shade. On the other hand, if you're starting off with just letting your lawn turn back into forest, then it much quicker. You don't have to go through the lichen and moss phase. Now, there are a number of important events that happened over the course of the development of life on Earth. Okay, scientists, of course, make up names that describe and are used to name particular parts of history, and these names will usually be names that don't mean anything to a non-scientist. What the hell's a Cretaceous? Well, we know the Cretaceous is the last portion of the age of dinosaurs that ended with the big rock that fell on Yucatan, that, all that. Scientists know that. The average bloke on the street, well, and a small boy of about 10 years old probably knows this stuff better, almost as well as the scientists do. For some reason, little boys just really get into this kind of stuff, especially the dinosaurs and all that. But it's a way of classifying the history in such a way that we can keep track of it. It's sort of like talking about, the Middle Ages or the Little Ice Age or things like that. Those are events that have to do with humans interacting with their environment, which means something to a historian. All right. Now, the one I want to focus on here is a period of time. It's represented in gray stripes here. That's just below halfway down in the 354 to 290 million years ago range. And those two particular time periods, called the Pennsylvanian and the Mississippian, are together the time period called the Carboniferous. Carbon. Carboniferous is when most of the coal was alive and when most of the petroleum was still phytoplankton. And it is this time when much of what we are burning now came from. Carboniferous. That's the last time coal was actually clean when it was alive. 300 million years ago. And the reason why the coal formed then was because there was a lot of oxygen in the atmosphere. A lot of oxygen in the atmosphere meant that fires could burn. You could have lightning strike and cause forest fires. The trees that had thicker bark were less likely to be killed by a moderate forest fire than ones that had thin bark. And so bark thickness increased during that time. Now, the bark is made up of this stuff called lignin, which is, or largely is, which is produced by the trees as a way of providing support. This is support structure chemical, and it's something that doesn't decompose very fast. Yeah. Oh, fungi are mostly the ones who were able to do it. Well, also there was a lot of swampy areas, and you had these trees with thick bark made up of lignin that didn't decompose very fast that grew in swamps. And when the tree died and it fell over, it was covered up by in the swamp, the bottom of the swamp, and didn't decompose very fast. And gradually, over millions of years, he got converted into coal. And it's because of the burial of those trees containing carbon in the swamp that oxygen was high. It was a positive feedback system. And fossil fuels were formed over a broad amount of time, but this was one of the most intensive times of fossil fuel production, fossilization, was during the Carboniferous, which is why they call it that. And fossil fuel, my grandmother back in Missouri used to call herself an old fossil, and she didn't really mean it. She was just saying she was getting old because and I explained to her, but she didn't appreciate my scientific point of view, that really if she wanted to be a fossil, she'd have to make some arrangements. And that meant, being interned somewhere where it was totally anaerobic and her body would turn into coal. I don't think she appreciated that suggestion. Anyway, but she was a good soul anyway. Petroleum is formed from dead ocean plankton that mixes in with mud at the bottom of the ocean, and heat and pressure turns it into petroleum. Coal is dead swamp plants. And coal, varies a lot in terms of its production, or in terms of its how much it's decomposed and how much it is fossilized. Peat, which is, the recently dead swamp plants, is not really coal yet, but if you give it enough time, it will be. And then lignite's the next stage, and bituminous and anthracite, so on. And you can tell the difference looking at it. Natural gas is one of those things that is produced as a byproduct of both petroleum production and coal production, which is why you can drill a hole and pump your oil out of a reserve underground and a lot of methane will come with it. Now, humans came along at some point. This is our relatives. I showed this slide once, and one of our anthropology professors, a woman, said, I dated one of those guys. Maybe she was joking. Anyway, humans arose in Africa, and we, at some point, 65 million years ago, left Africa because they needed to eat. It was a matter of you get up and leave because you need to find places to, food to feed your children. All animals do that, and we are no different. And from then, we spread out. Eventually, we made it all the way to Alaska, about 16,000, up to 16,000 years ago. But then we're kind of stuck until the ice age was over and the ice melted, and then we could go in and colonize North and South America. But we have been, we colonized a variety of places, including Australia, much earlier. And one of the things that seems to have made us human is our ability to take plants and animals and domesticate them. Get them, let's see, how many slides do I have left? All right, so I'm gonna cut through some of this because we're gonna run out of time. Domestication is an important thing in us being able to feed ourselves, not only because animals and plants are food sources, but because we can use them for other things as well. In fact, the first plant that was produced, that was domesticated, was a container. It wasn't a food source. And there are some animals and plants we were able to domesticate, and others we weren't, because they just didn't have the ability. Zebras would never domesticate, although we domesticated horses and donkeys, no problem. Zebras were just too irascible. And then there's other things like elephants. We were able to tame Asian elephants, but we were never able to domesticate them because they lived longer than we did. And so it's hard to control the breeding of an animal species if they live forever, or relative does. This was the first plant that humans domesticated, and it was a calabash gourd that could be used as a container. You could grow these things and dry them out and cut off the top and pull all the guts out, and you got yourself a canteen. Very useful thing to have. Wheat was probably the second one, and we were able to domesticate a good lot of plants in many continents over the years. Peas and wheat in the Fertile Crescent, which is the Middle East, millet, rice, soybeans in East Asia, and squash, maize, beans, manioc, and potatoes and peppers in tropical America. And it allowed us as humans because we were able to take these plants that we found useful and change who is mating with whom so that we get characteristics that we wanted, we became scientists. Because that's it. I mean, we're doing experiments trying to make a better potato plant. And we got so many different kinds of potatoes for that reason. Teosinte, which was a wild plant in the central part of Mexico, became corn. And we've done all sorts of things with corn. Okay. Animal domestication is even trickier because they have a will of their own of sorts. Anybody who has a dog knows that. And for an animal to be domesticated, they have to have a flexible diet, be willing to eat various things, fast growth rate. They have to be able to or willing to breed in captivity. They have to be pleasant in some way, biddable at least. They need to be unlikely to panic or tendency to flock, and they need to be able to establish or accept humans as part of their social hierarchy. Wolves were the first animal that domesticated, and they probably domesticated themselves by following around human bands and eating our trash, as dogs will today. At least mine will. And then gradually we realized that these critters can be useful for a variety of things. And a bunch of other animals were domesticated, along with dogs, sheep, goats, pigs, cows, horses, donkeys, water buffalo. All those are old world animals, as were the camels, except that the only large domestic animal in the Americas were the llama, alpaca, vicuña complex, which are American camels, and were domesticated in South America. And it's an amazing thing to think that all these other animals were domesticated in the old world, but only llamas and alpacas in the new world. And this led to one important thing, a quirk of history, is that in the old world, people who kept these animals came in contact with them, they'd be hurting them and all that. And so diseases that were found in cows and pigs and goats can jump species into humans. Some of them can. Okay. Like smallpox, like COVID, and so on. The Americans, the native indigenous people, did not have that advantage because none of their llamas and alpacas didn't share diseases with them. So that when indigenous Americans came in contact with indigenous Europeans, a lot of Indians died because they were not immune. They didn't have genetic immunities to these diseases. Other domestic animals of note: cats, chickens, ducks, geese, silkworms, which are caterpillars, reindeer, rabbits, carp, pigeons, all these things, but not quite domesticated, including honeybees, because their genetics is so different um, than than uh, than the mammals and birds, and Asian elephants because they live too long, although they can be tamed to a certain degree. The only domestic animals in the New World were llamas, alpacas, turkeys, and guinea pigs, which were a meat animal in South America. Now, the implications of agriculture for development of humanity, the implications of of to the climate, we would not been able to change the climate in the way we did if we did not have agriculture to raise our populations to such a point that we had enough of us to do this. And the implications of agriculture also led to sedentary societies based on villages and towns instead of wanderers and hunters and gatherers. Higher human populations, you had more food, fewer people starved. Labor diversification and trade economies, hierarchical ideologies, governments, organized religions, art, architecture, property regimes, writing, and of course, money. And all those because of our relationships with other animals and plants that also impacted our effects on the environment that we're having right now. And there we have it. And I stayed within my time. So I would be delighted to answer questions if you have them.
We have one, Bill. I think with spring coming up earlier, would you have an up arrow? Oh, up our arrow on slide 3 to go back on that.
Oh, slide it. Okay. That one probably. That one? Which one?
Yeah.
Which parameter are we talking about?
You just said I would think that the spring coming earlier would have an up arrow on slide 3.
Yeah, well, yeah, that probably is. I didn't even notice that before. You think I know?
Hmm.
Yep, you're right.
So
I
thanks,
did.
Bill.
I didn't make the slide. I lifted it from someplace, and sometimes you miss a few of those details. You're right. Thank you for pointing that out.
If anyone has any questions, please put it in the chat. Do we have any evidence of how long ago the first animal was domesticated?
Well,
And which is the first animal to
let's
be
see.
domesticated?
The last of the last of the ice age was 16,000 years ago. And so we were hunters and gatherers. It would have been probably before the end of the last ice age, because we would have been hunters and gatherers roaming the, Eurasia and where wolves are. And there would have been some of those wolves that were so hungry they wanted to come raid our trash. And people decided that these things can actually, we might be able to get some use out of them. Also, the wolves, there were some of them that were a little bit more gentle, or were a little less deadly, in that there were fewer of them eating our children, and so that made them more tolerable. And so Ringo here, who's been, lurking about, is, in the same species as a wolf.
Really?
Well, yeah, wolves, coyotes, and large dogs can interbreed if they're similar size. I don't think Ringo could. He's too small.
Wow.
Beside, in additional to have been fixed.
We have a question. If a lawn is not mowed today, what is the likelihood that it would be just be taken over by invasive plants rather than a more welcome variety of plants?
You will get the plant that has windblown seeds first. And so likely you're going to start off with dandelions and ragweed and a bunch of other things. Now, who knows? There may be certain circumstances where you have pretty flowers upwind that blow down into your yard and you get a nice garden out of the deal. But, probably the likelihood is relatively slim.
Okay, great question. Do we have any other questions before we call it an evening? And I know that the sunset's getting a little later and later.
Yeah, it's not dark yet, quite, up on our hill.
So today's the day where we get actually 12 hours of darkness and 12 hours of light.
More or less. And the reason why it's more or less is the world is not perfectly spherical, and it has a wobble. So that, it's the timing of these things varies a little bit. Usually the winter solstice, or the spring equinox, is the 21st of March. This year it's a little earlier, and that's,
Okay.
Yep, but first day of spring.
Yay.
Yeah, Ringo.
So we don't have any more questions, so we'll just call it an evening. Be sure to I'll post a link up to this upload sometime tomorrow. I'll send it all to you.
Right.
And please share it. And be sure to register for our next episode. So be on the lookout for that. And thanks for everyone. Thank you.
I hate to interrupt, but is there a way I can ask a quick question?
Sure.
Go ahead. Sure, that's why we're here.
What do you say with there are many people who claim that these were natural, or this is just a natural warming and cooling? What do you? I mean, obviously, I don't believe that. What do you say to them? That they're not really thinking straight.
Well, I mean, because we have data. We have data that shows that the speed at which it is warming right now, it far exceeds what happens in nature, has happened in nature. And the real big shut up comment is, if you have someone who's who says, oh, it's not real, or I don't believe in climate change. And you say, well, you may not believe in climate change, but your insurance company does.
Yes, yes, exactly.
Yeah. So you've got the insurance companies have their actuarials out there calculating to the penny how much it's going to they can charge for insurance to help rebuild your house after it burns in California or floods in Florida or wherever. So they know it's coming. They've got it all figured. They know how much it's going to cost. So
Thank you.
yeah,
That's an excellent way to put it. I appreciate
yeah,
it.
no, I didn't make that up. I heard it somewhere. I think after, it may be after the California fires, and I use it a lot because it's obvious and clear, and it's hard to dispute.
Indeed,
Bringing
hard to dispute, especially if you're trying to get
death and
insurance for your
insurance.
house in Florida. If you have a house in Florida
Yeah, or California.
or California. So anyway, thank you all for joining us this evening. We'll see you next time. Until then, have a great evening.
All righty.